Hello, my name is Kate Menconeri. I am the Curator and Director of Exhibitions and Collections at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. I also oversee the Cole Fellowship Program, and it's by far one of the most rewarding and energizing aspects of all that we do. Each year we select 4 applicants to join us for a 1-year full-time fellowship. Fellows get to live and work on site where Thomas Cole once lived and worked. And this year's group has been an extraordinary team and very busy. They have conducted major primary research. They've welcomed thousands of visitors, and they've worked with staff behind the scenes on projects in education, exhibition, publication, collections, and so much more. Some of the highlights for me include showing us how to make gorgeous 19th century egg dyes, filming the artist Chocorua about his new work tracing Thomas Cole's footsteps, and then aligning the Mandarin and English subtitles. They hosted countless art out events. They've researched how to make the Cole site more ecologically sustainable, and they've helped us reinterpret the creative process exhibition. So it's been an honor to work with this team, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the 2020 class of fellows: Alex McCarty, Marissa Hamm, Ann Comer, and Hampton Smith. Each year I'm struck by the unique qualities and gifts that each fellow brings to our team. This year's group stands out for their independent thinking, their tenacity, and their resilience. I am so grateful for their resilience. It feels like we need that now more than ever. And in this moment of uncertainty and change, it's been art, poetry, history, and science that I find myself turning to for sustenance and inspiration. And Thomas Cole, who in his 1841 lecture on American scenery wrote, "The liberal arts carry within them the power to mend our hearts." I know they also offer us the power to ask questions, to think critically, to make deeper connections with our past and with each other right now. Now, I had hoped that we would all be together raising a glass in Thomas Cole's new studio, but here we are in the world of Zoom, occasionally out of sync, occasionally completely frozen, but determined nonetheless to bring to you the amazing and timely research conducted by our fellows this year, who will be joining us from North Carolina, California, New York, and Ohio. The fellows remind me every day why our work and why the Thomas Cole National Historic Site matters. Now, before we begin the presentations, I do want to thank our board and our staff. And I'd like to thank Olivia Litchens, who has been getting up before dawn to help us create this virtual presentation. Thank you, Livy. And I also want to thank Warner Shook, our board member, who is also a Tony Award nominated director. Warner works with our fellows all year on something that's often overlooked but that really matters: their presentation skills. I want to thank you, Warner, for being so generous. You've worked with the fellows all year and what feels like every day of the quarantine so far. The poise, the confidence, and the esteem that you inspire in our fellows stays with them far beyond today. So after the presentations, there will be a live Q&A. I hope you'll join us. Thank you for being with us for this extraordinary program, and I hope you enjoy these fascinating presentations.
Hello all, my name is Hampton Smith, and on behalf of all of the Thomas Cole Fellows of 2020, I would like to thank you so much for coming today. But before we get started on these virtual presentations, it is important to remember that we are all on stolen land that once belonged to a diverse set of Indigenous peoples and nations. As you can see on this map below me, in North America alone, there are over 100 different Indigenous tribal nations, covering almost every part of what we now consider to be the United States. We want to acknowledge these nations' ongoing survival and their past, present, and future stewardship of our land. Our land acknowledgement brings me to the subject and title of my presentation, Last Indian, Dead Hemlock, Thomas Cole and the Imagined Indian. There is not a single allegorical figure that Thomas Cole returned to with such frequency as the Native American, spanning throughout his entire lifetime from over 30 sketches to 25 completed paintings to many mentions scattered in his journals, poetry, and short fiction. There is no overlooking the importance of the Native American to Thomas Cole's enduring legacy. Often in the foreground, sometimes camouflaged or engaged in a hunt, the indigenous figures in Cole's work stand at the literal precipice of his epic landscape practice. Are these figures romanticized and stereotypical of Native American people? What was Thomas Cole's perspective about Native Americans and their forced removal? How did his paintings figure into his time period, and how might they figure into our own? Although I plan to touch on the many dynamic questions these paintings conjure, I want to emphasize that Cole's representations are complicated. They changed over time, and sometimes they deviate from any art historian's grasp. Indeed, my project offers more questions than answers. But my research this year was to only begin addressing this critical issue by identifying what is at stake and better defining what future research needs to be conducted. Scholars of Thomas Cole, from Alan Wallach to Tim Berenger, have often mentioned the inclusion of Native Americans in his many paintings. But few scholars, besides perhaps Scott Diamond and Nancy Palm Puchner, have thoroughly digested Thomas Cole's representations of the Native American in relation to ideas of colonialism and environmentalism. Some scholars have emphasized how Cole thought of Native Americans as representing the pre-contact period of the United States, a time when, in the words of Thomas Cole himself, a very few generations have passed away since this vast tract of the American continent, now the United States, rested in the shadow of primeval forest, whose gloom was peopled by savage beasts and scarcely less savage men. Other scholars have emphasized the period specificity of Thomas Cole's Native American representations. As an artist in the mid-19th century, Thomas Cole was working during a time of dramatic transformation, rife with political and social turmoil built upon the continued removal of indigenous bodies for resource extraction, agriculture, and settlement. The forced removal of Native Americans, however, began centuries before President Jackson's removal policies during Cole's time. By the time he even got to the Catskills, the majority of the indigenous peoples native to that area, primarily the Mohican individuals, have been forcibly removed. And we can see that from the red line that bridges the Hudson River Valley all the way over to present-day Wisconsin. But Cole was not necessarily interested in representing or even trying to represent indigenous peoples of the Hudson River Valley. In fact, Cole's Native American figure is somewhat of a combine, much like his landscapes, pieced together from a variety of sketches and sources and primary accounts. The image of the Native American becomes a prop, a costume, an image, and a grand moral narrative that celebrated the pure, untouched wilderness against the encroachment of white civilization. Although Cole likely did not meet an individual from the Hudson River Valley, he did engage with Haudenosaunee peoples on an early trip to the Niagara Falls in 1829. Writing in his journal, Cole observes, "The most interesting objects were several Indians, but the interest was a sad one. They looked cleaner and better clothed than I expected. Several even looked very respectful. Note that Cole describes these people as interesting objects. He expects them to be dirty, but instead, his stereotypes are overturned. But tellingly, the level of detail in paintings made after this occasion, even those of the Niagara Falls, don't hew to meeting actual Indigenous individuals. Nothing changes about how Cole represents Native Americans. This is in part because Cole was not interested in the specificity, the accuracy, or the agency of the Native American peoples in his landscapes. Rather, he was interested in the popular characterization of an idealized Native American, otherwise known as an Indian, savage, or red man. To establish this point, it might be helpful to compare Cole to another artist that he met in 1838, George Catlin. According to a letter written by Mariah Cole, the Coles took a trip with the Durans to see George Catlin's Indian Gallery in Albany in the 1830s. Mariah notes that the lecture and museum was extremely interesting. Catlin is an artist that has been among the different Indian tribes between the Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains for 7 years for the purpose of getting information respecting their manners and customs. He showed a great portrait of many tribes with an account of each and their different dresses. Mariah's letter attests to George Catlin's status as an ethnographic artist. He was interested in portraying, collecting, and displaying information regarding the specificities of Native tribes and their customs. And we can see that on the two portraits I featured here today, which is just two examples of the many, most of which are kept in the Smithsonian Museum today. After spending years documenting and painting the many tribal members across the Americas, Catlin actually organized a traveling Indian gallery where Indigenous individuals' portraits and objects from their actual homes were hung along the walls in a crowded, tiny room that encouraged a kind of similar sense of the sublime, of a different other that Cole was kind of after in his landscape paintings. One would think that such a rich exposure to Native American culture would shift how Cole himself depicted Indigenous individualized. But the art historian can detect no change in Cole's practice. Indeed, Cole's figures remain as miniaturized romantic Indians, far from the subject of ethnographic portraits. We see this ideal of the kind of romantic Indian emerge early in Cole's training. At the Philadelphia Academy, Cole used a model in an Indian costume as a guide for representing figures. Or we can look to one of Cole's sketchbooks, created in 1827, which illustrates that Cole was literally copying images from a German ethnographer of Creek Indians and placing them into his canvases of the Hudson River Valley, Creek Indians, of course, being from the southern United States and not the Hudson River Valley. So Cole was therefore in the habit of misplacing Indigenous figures, never quite placing them in their native landscapes. But Cole was certainly not alone in this endeavor. The romantic ideal of the Native American was well ingrained into the artistic society of the 19th century in three primary forms. The first, evocative and one of Cole's paintings of The Last of the Mohicans, presents Native Americans as diabolical savages. The second, the noble savage archetype, seen here in Cole's Cross in the Wilderness, illustrates a chief bowing at the gravestone of a missionary who allegedly kind of civilized him through Christianity. And finally, the disappearing Indian stereotype, where a lone Indian looking out at a fading sunset not only illustrates the pain and suffering of Indigenous individuals, but crystallizes and essentializes that they no longer existed when, of course, they did and still do. Someone might be thinking, well, Cole's white figures are equally as romanticized. Like his Native Americans, white figures are small, somewhat inconsequential to the land itself. But white figures interact with nature and are represented within nature in a totally different way. In many paintings, they picnic, they farm, they own houses, they cut down trees. They are agents of the land and its future history. Native Americans, by contrast, are often pictured from their backs, looking out at a setting sun. They do not own property. They do not build houses. They do not own families, nor do they paint landscapes. They are often warriors, stuck in the past, and unable to be a part of white civilization. To further this point, we can look to Cole's most discussed cycle of paintings, The Course of Empire. The Savage State, the first in this cycle, depicts what Cole regarded as the beginning of civilization. Notice that the savages here are painted as white, but that also in the background, there are wigwams and people playing the cross, both evocative of the cultural imaginary surrounding Native Americans. So here, Cole sees savagery as an ideological construct that spans world cultures, white, indigenous, or otherwise. But tellingly, only white actors are able to become a part of learned society and build civilizations. On the other hand, however, they also eventually destroy society. Perhaps Cole saw the ways in which indigenous peoples interacted with the land as a good thing, a way of life that was firmly against the harmful effects of his fellow colonizers' unfettered progress. We might even ask, did Cole see environmental destruction as connected to indigenous destruction? In a note describing an idea for a future painting, Cole writes, "Last Indian, dead Hemlock." Here, Cole unites the ravages of the axe with indigenous loss. Developing upon this idea is Cole's story, The Death of Chocorua. In this mythic tale, Chief Chocorua, the last member of a fictional tribe, is forced to his death by a group of white settlers. As he falls, Chocorua utters a curse which, according to Cole, hangs heavy on the land to this day. The cattle of the whites perish on the hunting grounds of Mount Chocorua, which I should note features prominently in many of Cole's works. Cole's fascination with this myth, whether through his sketches, short fiction, paintings, or engravings, reveal that Cole at times laments the white settlers who came and brought the ruthless destruction of native peoples and their original environments. Cole instructs readers of this mythic tale to regard the land as a record of history. Much like his famous essay on American scenery, Cole notes in The Tale of Chocorua, I quote, "The proud Indian has roamed through. Here are many spots where his traditions and superstitions have hollowed, where he has died in defense of his inheritance." Not long after, Cole switched from a fictional tale to a historic archive. Writing in the late 1830s, Cole notes, "I have at length discovered what I have long desired, the Indian name of the high falls of the Catterskill. The names of the falls, Quatawignac." Here, we see Cole earnestly attempting to understand the legacy of indigenous peoples and the land, perhaps through his own kind of archival research. I want to reiterate that by claiming that any of Cole's romantic representations are actually Native Americans, or claim any sense to indigenous reality, we can easily reconfirm the colonial logic of domination that sees Indigenous lives as archaic, unmodern, static, or merely inanimate. As we have seen, however, Cole saw the forced tragedy of Native peoples as somehow connected to the rapid industrialization, deforestation, and capital greed that plagued his and our societies. So instead of emphasizing his figures, I suggest we think how the land holds history and how advocating for Indigenous well-being is, in effect, also advocating for honoring the land, something I think Cole himself wanted from viewers of his epic landscapes. I want to close by turning our attention to another landscape artist. Kay Walkingstick, a Cherokee contemporary artist born in Syracuse, New York in 1935, interrogates the limits and possibility of landscape as a genre for anti-colonial critique and Indigenous perspectives. Kay's first ever diptych, Death of the Elm, was commissioned by the town of Cooperstown as part of an artistic response to the Dutch elm disease of the mid-20th century. The disease, which has decimated up to 75% of the elm population, surely references the ongoing logic of settler colonialism to destroy in order to overproduce. On one side of her diptych, Walkingstick paints a sketchy but quite literal illustration of a singular elm tree, evoking the Hudson River School in its formulaic, perspectival depiction of a singular elm, and perhaps even riffing off Cole's own singular tree sketches from earlier in his life. On the other side of the diptych, an abstracted surface made of multiple acrylic and wax layers has been torn, scratched, and gouged, as if the canvas itself was a piece of bark, the body of an elm tree, or the skin of a native figure. One might emphasize the visual and historical differences between the two canvases, between Hudson River School and abstraction. But it's important to take into account Walkingstick's action of binding the two canvases together. Walkingstick's united juxtaposition forms a creative act of kinship across the two canvases. Here too, we might imagine the unity between these canvases as similar to Cole's own dash between those lone Indian and the dead Hemlock, between Indigenous livelihood and ecological destruction. By placing Kay Walkingstick's painting within a larger genealogy of ecological artists, Thomas Cole being the example here, we visualize the contested ground of history and allow creative acts of kinship to guide our future relationships to the land. We are, of course, still inhabiting the stolen land of the Mohican peoples, the people of the river which flows both ways. Seen in this map, the Mohican peoples resided in a large part of the Hudson River Valley and interacted with many different tribal nations. Decimated over the course of 3 centuries by Dutch and English colonizers for the production of resources, land, and cheap labor, the Mohican peoples belong to a rich society built upon a sustainable relationship between all forms of nature and being. Now, residing primarily in Wisconsin, the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican peoples are still agents of change in this world, yet they constantly face challenges over land and water resources, especially within our current climate crisis. The end of my fellowship will be spent actively cultivating reciprocal relations that have long to been unfair and unaddressed. By proposing a permanent land acknowledgement and working directly with local and removed tribal members, I hope to begin a conversation that brings more perspective and voices to the table. And together, we can begin laying a new groundwork for future endeavors to honor this land and its original inhabitants. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marissa Hamm, and as a Cole Fellow this year, I focused my research on the legacy of Thomas Cole as carried on by his descendants living at the Cedar Grove property between 1848 and 1961. Now, normally when we think about Cole and legacy, we naturally think about his artwork. But Cole's many descendants also carried on Cole's legacy by continuing to live at Cedar Grove and preserve this space and keep it within the family, so that one day it could become the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. However, we didn't know too much about Cole's descendants in this time period until about 2 years ago when Cole Fellow Michael Kitosaka conducted his research on the formation of the Thomas Cole National Historic Site, focusing on 1961 when Edith Cole Silberstein acquired the Cedar Grove property, Thomas Cole's great-granddaughter and the last family member to own the home, all the way through till 2001 with the official opening of the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. But what happened at Cedar Grove between the years of 1848 and 1961? My work has been to shed light on this pivotal and fascinating time period. So in order to start this project, I of course began with a timeline, and I focused on the years of 1787 through till 1979, because 1787 is when the Thompson family, Mariah's family, originally purchased Cedar Grove, and 1979 is when Edith Cole Silberstein, Thomas Cole's great-granddaughter, officially sold the property outside of the Cole and Thompson families. In order to create this timeline, I looked at a variety of primary documents, and in particular, I focused on land records, like this 1841 mortgage, in order to figure out when the family bought property, sold property, or had to file for a mortgage. In addition to these land records, I also looked at a lot of census documents in order to figure out who was living at the property at what time. In the process of finding these various documents, the story of the Cole family between 1848 and 1961 gradually became more apparent, and I realized that although the family remained socially important due to their continued connection with Thomas Cole, they lived in a state of constant financial struggle. So for this presentation today, I will discuss my research in this timeline by focusing on the 3 homeowners after Thomas Cole passed away, beginning first with his wife, Mariah Bartow Cole, who was head of the house between 1848 and 1884. Then I will discuss Theddy, Theodore Cole, who was Thomas Cole's oldest child and head of the house between 1884 and 1928. And finally, I will talk about Florence Cole Vincent, who is the granddaughter of Thomas Cole and Theddy's oldest child. Florence was head of the house between 1928 and 1961. Before I can discuss these 3 figures, however, it is important to establish that the Cole family's financial difficulties in this time period did not begin in 1848 when Thomas Cole passed away, but rather they began in the 1820s with the Thompson family, Mariah's family, and in particular, John Alexander Thompson, or as his family called him, Uncle Sandy. Uncle Sandy was a wealthy businessman in Catskill until he retired in 1831. In retirement, Uncle Sandy transformed Cedar Grove into a home farm, meaning he was someone who ran a farm that was not meant to be a huge source of income for a family. It was more or less a hobby. However, in retirement, Uncle Sandy continued to fall into great debt, largely due to the settling of his late brother, Thomas Thompson's estate. And in order to help with his debts, Uncle Sandy took out mortgages and loans from friends. And when he passed away in 1846, all of these unpaid debts then became the burden of his family. At first, this meant Thomas Cole, who was one of the executors of Uncle Sandy's estate. But as we know, 2 short years later in 1848, Thomas Cole also passed away. And as you can see here in a portion of his final probate, Thomas Cole left behind paintings, painting materials, and even savings in the bank for his family. His loss meant that the family no longer had someone bringing in a source of income on a regular basis. So, to set the stage for 1848, when Mariah Cole became head of the house, Mariah was a newly widowed mother of 4 children, all under the age of 10 years old. She was living on over 110 acres of property that she and her 3 sisters owned. Their only option for income is the family's home farm, but as I've mentioned, a home farm is not able to financially sustain a large family. And on top of all of this, Mariah had to still pay back the debts left behind by her Uncle Sandy. Despite this mountain of difficulties facing Mariah, when she became head of the house in 1848, her focus was seemingly to maintain the status quo. So you'll see that the property she inherited is exactly how much property Uncle Sandy left to her and her sisters in 1846, and it doesn't change much during her tenure. So in order to maintain the status quo, Mariah wanted to keep the memory of her husband alive, and she wanted to do this by preserving his 2 studio spaces to exactly the way he left them upon his passing. However, Mariah's goal of keeping these spaces sacred unfortunately collided with the family's financial realities. So in the 1850s, Mariah had to begin renting her husband's studio space. The only known person she rented this space to was an artist from Massachusetts by the name of B.B.G. Stone. And Stone began renting in 1856 for an annual fee of $70. So what were some of the costs that Mariah was facing that would make her take such drastic action as to rent her husband's studio space? Well, of course, as I've mentioned, Mariah had to deal with the debts left behind by her Uncle Sandy. And in addition to this, Mariah and her sisters had to take out more mortgages, and in particular, a mortgage on the family's vault lot, the parcel of non-contiguous property to the north of Cedar Grove. And the vault lot had this name because the Thompson family had built a family vault on the property, and they buried their deceased family members there until 1858, when Mariah had these family members moved to the Catskill Cemetery, which freed the family's connection to the vault lot and opened it up to be rented as a source of income. However, it retained the name vault lot for the rest of the Cole family's ownership. In addition to these mortgages and debts, Mariah was also, of course, paying for the education of her children. For example, her oldest son, Theddy, attended school in Prattsville with a tutor named Mr. Wright. And Mariah had to pay for the servants and farmhands that helped out at Cedar Grove. So what were some of the ways that Mariah brought in income for herself? Well, there's 2 distinct periods for this. There's the period before her oldest son, Theddy, and her other children came of age and began to financially help at Cedar Grove. And then there's the time once her children were old enough and began helping with management of Cedar Grove. So before Theddy came of age, we know that the family as early as 1855 was renting their main house to boarders as a source of income. Then, once Theddy came of age in about 1860, he began helping to sell some of his father's artwork. He helped with paintings such as Prometheus Bound, Narrow's Arch, and a painting called Mount Washington. Without consistent documentation, it's unclear how much Theddy actually sold these for, or if he actually ever sold any of them. In one letter, he was offered money for the painting called Mount Washington, about $1,300, which today is around $39,000. However, it's unclear if Theddy actually sold it for this price. By 1879, Theddy's help with selling his father's paintings quickly vanished when his friend, Daniel Huntington, who helped Theddy to sell artwork from his New York City studio, notified Theddy that he was having difficulty selling any Hudson River School art as it was no longer popular. So Theddy also helped his family by continuing to run the family farm for his mother, which remained a minimal source of income. And in addition to this, Theddy had a connection with Frederick Church, as did the whole family. Frederick Church was Thomas Cole's young student who lived at Cedar Grove in the mid-1840s while he studied. And during that time, he became very close family friends. So when he permanently moved to the Hudson Valley in 1860 and built his home, Olana, across the river from Cedar Grove, Frederick Church hired Theddy to be the manager for his farm at Olana. And this went on for about 2 decades, for which Theddy was paid around $100 a month to do this. In addition to this, Frederick, his wife Isabel, his parents, and even his sisters were all close to the Cole family and were deeply concerned about their financial difficulties. So Frederick would frequently gift family members increments of money, usually in $100, in letters that he sent. And he would disguise these gifts as being on the occasion of a birthday or a special occasion, holiday, in order to prevent the Cole family from having any sense of embarrassment, and so that they could take this money and use it. And it was a very tactful way to do this. And Frederick wasn't alone. His father, his sisters, they all helped out the Cole family in ways that they could. Despite all of these efforts, however, by 1882, the family was in such great debt that the local community established an annuity fund for Mariah, the wife of the artist, so that she wouldn't have to worry in her late years at Cedar Grove about being evicted from the space. And you'll notice here on the annuity fund page from it, some important donor names like the churches, and even former patrons of Cole like the Sturgis family. When Mariah passed away in 1884, Cedar Grove then became the property of her 4 children, with her oldest child, Theddy, taking over as head of the house. You'll notice that the property Theddy inherited did not drastically change during his mother's lifetime, beyond the vault lot property being opened up to rental. So during Theddy's tenure as head of the house, his focus was to address his family's financial issues. And this wasn't so much something that Theddy wanted to do as it was something he needed to do. Upon Mariah's passing, the Cole family owed around $21,000 of debt, which today is roughly $500,000. So immediately after Mariah passed away, Theddy and his siblings began schemes to leverage their property for money. One of the first things they did is they laid plans to subdivide a large portion of their property west of Spring Street into 60 new housing lots that could be rented or sold. In addition to this, Theddy became the secretary of the Catskill Waterworks Board. And in this capacity, he led plans to create a reservoir development along the northern border of Cedar Grove, using some of the Cedar Grove property and allowing the family free access to fresh water. In addition to the property, Theddy also continued to run the family's farm. As you can see him here with some farm hands. However, the farm at Cedar Grove remained to be a home farm. It produced mostly fruit, like apples and other orchard produce, and any profit from the farm mostly covered the costs of farming itself or paying some of the servants and farm hands. So Theddy and his siblings thought of new ways to bring in sources of income. One of the major things they did is create a new picnicking facility called Cole's Grove, using their 30 acres of waterfront property along the Hudson River. So throughout the last decade of the 19th century, Cole's Grove was an extremely popular picnicking destination in the area. And Theddy and his siblings built a pavilion, bathhouses, and even installed electric lights in this space, and regularly hosted different events for the community there. Despite the popularity of this picnicking facility, however, in 1901, the Cole children decided to sell their entire Cole's Grove property, all 30 acres, for $11,000, which today is roughly $335,000. So although Cole's Grove was profitable as a picnicking facility, it was even more helpful to sell this large portion of property and immediately address some of their debts. In addition to Cole's Grove, throughout this time, Emily Cole, Thomas Cole's daughter, was a practicing artist, and she painted beautiful botanicals on china and paper in her father's studios, and she sold her work both locally and in New York City to great acclaim. So in the same way as her father had before her, Emily helped her family financially by creating art. Eventually, all of Theddy and his siblings' schemes paid off when in 1920, Theddy is listed on the federal census as owning property that is no longer mortgaged. So it took nearly a century after his Uncle Sandy's first mortgage in 1838, but Theddy was finally able to free his family from their cycle of mortgage loans and debts. When Theddy passed away in 1928, he left the Cedar Grove property to his 3 children, Florence, Mary Emily, and Thomas Cole III. And Florence, his oldest child, took over as head of the house between 1928 and 1961. You'll notice the property Florence inherited drastically changed during her father's tenure. Not only did Theddy sell off the 30 acres of property along the Hudson River, but he also opened up a lot of the Cedar Grove property to be subdivided and rented or sold, And the vault lot has been bisected by a railroad company that laid down tracks through the Coles property. During Florence's tenure as head of the house, Cedar Grove left behind its golden era. I say this because Florence was the first person to ever live at Cedar Grove alone. Between 1850 and 1940, on average, 10 people were living at Cedar Grove at any given time. As Thomas Cole's great-granddaughter, Edith Cole Silverstein, describes in her story Our Lovable Eccentrics, Cedar Grove was, quote, a welcome refuge for widowed family members and homeless relations. Over the years, many extended family lived in the Cedar Grove home their entire lives, and many servants and farmhands lived on the premises with their own families, so the area was always a bustling spot. However, Florence's two siblings, once they married or found a job, permanently moved out of the family's property. And although Florence initially lived on the property with her aging mother, Eugenia Casey Cole, Eugenia passed away in 1934, and by the 1940 census, Florence is listed as the sole occupant of Cedar Grove. So as the sole occupant, Florence financially supported herself by continuing to run the family's farm. This farm remained to be small, a home farm, and it primarily produced fruit, and Florence would sell the apples down the river in New York City, and then she sold the other produce either locally in Catskill, or she would take trips into the mountains to sell it to local resorts. In addition to farming, Florence also created her own business called the Thomas Cole Studios Antiques. And you'll see that Florence displayed her antique furniture, china, and glass in her grandfather's two studios, and kept a lot of his artwork on the walls as a reminder to its former famous occupant. So throughout Florence's life, she had a reputation for being stubborn and frugal. As her niece, Edith Cole Silverstein, again described in her story, my aunt's thrift knew no bounds. Although there are a lot of negative connotations associated with this type of personality, Florence's stubborn and frugal aspects really helped her during her tenure. From the outset, Florence faced challenges to her management of the property. Right away when she acquired the property in 1928, her two siblings wanted to sell the Cedar Grove property and collect their profits. But Florence would not allow this and continued to live there and manage the property to prevent her siblings from doing this. In addition to this, in a larger context, Florence held onto the Cedar Grove property throughout the 1930s and the Great Depression in the US. And in the 1930s, she faced a new foe in the New York Bridge Authority, which in 1933 revealed plans to construct the Rip Van Winkle Bridge. These original plans required the demolition of all of the Cedar Grove property and buildings in order to create the bridge approach. But luckily, with enough protests from Florence, her siblings, and the surrounding community, the Bridge Authority decided to avoid controversy, and they altered their plans so that the buildings would not need to be destroyed, and only some of the Cedar Grove property needed to be bought. So throughout these different challenges, Florence's focus was to keep the memory of her grandfather, Thomas Cole, alive. And she started doing this by collecting all of these primary documents related to her grandfather and the family, and she organized these materials and donated them to large institutions like the New York State Library for future researchers like myself to be able to reference. In addition to this, Florence also had a big role in the art world at this time. And she assisted with a lot of exhibitions of her grandfather's work, giving out loans, and she even attended exhibition openings, like you can see her here at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, attending the 100-year anniversary show of her grandfather's work. In addition to these ways, Florence also expressed herself creatively. And although she did not do this in the same way as her grandfather and her Aunt Emily Cole before her by painting, she did express herself by transforming the Cedar Grove gardens. So you can see her use of landscaped gardens and large open lawn spaces with statues throughout. Florence's final act to keep the legacy of her grandfather alive was when she passed away in 1961, and she left the property to her niece, Edith Cole Silverstein. Florence likely saw Edith as someone who cared deeply about the property because she had grown up visiting Cedar Grove, and even in her adulthood, came to the property with her own children to visit frequently. So Edith saw Florence as someone who would fight to keep Cedar Grove intact in the family and as a testament to Thomas Cole's legacy. Which brings us now to 1961, where Michael's research begins, and Edith's early efforts to establish Cedar Grove as a historic site. So why does knowing about all of these people and the events of this time period important? Well, on one hand, this research gives the site a better understanding of why the Cedar Grove property went from being over 110 acres in 1848 to what we have today, a little over 3 acres of land. More importantly, however, it is an honor to have inherited Cedar Grove, and we have Thomas Cole's descendants, many of whom were women, to thank. Without their efforts over the years to keep Cedar Grove intact and in the family, we may not have the Thomas Cole National Historic Site as we know it today, a museum that is open to the public and remembers Thomas Cole in his 2 studios and final home. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Alex McCarty, and the Thomas Cole site interprets Cole as a proto-ecologist in the sense that Cole was really thinking critically about nature and about industry before the conscious existence of an environmental movement or even before the word ecology was formally used. So my project was to interpret Cole within this later framework of ecology, and I think in so doing, we can not only glean a deeper understanding of Cole's motivations, but also excavate some of the roots of our present conflict in environmental discourse. So with that being said, in 1836, Cole painted what could be read as a succinct distillation of some of his hopes and anxieties. In what we now call the Oxbow, Cole's juxtaposed this patchwork of subdued, harvested fields against a chaotic, variegated wilderness trapped in the midst of a storm. Between these 2 extremes, the Connecticut River twists almost as if into a question mark, like Cole were asking America which path it would take. Cole confronted a nation caught between its burgeoning commercial interests and abundant natural resources. As America faced these existential questions about its future, Cole sought to cultivate a deeper appreciation for nature among his fellow countrymen. Thomas Cole was born in 1801 in England and in Bolton, and grew up around Lancashire in Bolton, which is situated in the scenic mountainous West Pennine Moors, but was also an early hub for industrialization. By the time Cole was born in 1801, Bolton was already overcrowded and suffered from poor sanitation. There were factories, textile factories in particular, foundries and mills, and the canal that ran through Bolton, the River Kroll, was used to transport coal and other industrial waste such that it was said to run black. So you can imagine this very polluted environment that Thomas Cole grew up in England as a boy. And he was also perhaps impacted by a Luddite rebellion on the outskirts of Bolton in 1812. The Luddites were, of course, a particularly radical group of anti-industrialists who, many of whom had lost their jobs or at least seen the quality of their labor and quantity of their wages decrease as a result of industrialization. And thus, many of them often violently sought to dismantle the factories and machineries that were the very means of production for an industrial society. Thus, Cole was influenced by this social upheaval and environmental degradation that seemed to accompany unchecked industry in his youth in England. And perhaps this predisposed him to look critically upon industry and fondly upon nature as he matured. When Thomas Cole first came to the United States in 1818, he perhaps expected to encounter a more pristine wilderness than what he ultimately found. By the time Cole first forayed up the Hudson River in 1825, the Catskills region had already begun its own period of rapid industrial expansion. Not unlike Bolton, there were mills and foundries, but particular to the Catskills area was the booming tanning industry. Tanning being the process of turning raw leather into a stained, more commercially viable product. So given its rich tannin content, hemlock bark makes for an excellent tanning agent for raw leather. And in the 19th century, or the early 19th century, the Catskills abounded with hemlock groves and also with running water that made for an excellent power source for these tanneries. The region also had access to international markets via New York City and the Hudson River. And all of these factors coalesced, so to speak, to really provide the region with this booming tanning industry. In fact, the Catskills hosted in the 19th century 64 tanneries, the concentration of which were in Greene County, which is, of course, where Thomas Cole ultimately came to reside. The enormous resource input required by these tanneries have led scholars to observe that by the mid-1830s, the forests of the Catskills had already largely been destroyed. And this was in no small part due to the railroad industry, which was ever expanding in the 19th century. So it wasn't just the tanneries that were destroying the forests, nor was it just the forests that were impacted by expanding industry. The tanneries and other industries also had a devastating consequence for the local watersheds, leading Catskill historian Alf Evers to describe that the very earth of the Catskills was migrating to the valleys and the seas below. As industry and the railroads expanded, the forest would be asked to provide more than they could provide. The railroad industry really took off in the Catskills in the early 19th century, and the Catskill-Canojoharie Railroad first began its construction in 1836. While it never reached its full realization, the Catskill-Canojoharie, or Canojoharie Catskill as it's actually called, laid 26 miles of track along the Catskill Creek. And the timber and lumber for these tracks was sourced from the local valleys. And that left an indelible mark on the valley. Even though the Catskill-Canojoharie never reached its full realization, by 1850, railroads crisscrossed the valley, which would leave a lasting impact. The tanning industry boomed almost concurrently with Thomas Cole's tenure in the Catskills between 1825 and 1845. But by 1817, a gentleman named Jonathan Palin had opened his own tannery in the Catskills. Palin's tannery grew large enough to support its own town, named Palinsville, and inspired many other imitators to flock to the Catskills to take advantage of the region's abundance of hemlock groves. By 1825, Greene County produced more tanned leather than the rest of New York State combined. This was in no small part due to the establishment that year of a new tannery in the mountains by a different gentleman named Zadok Pratt. Pratt came to the mountains and observed the area near what is now called Prattsville and said, perhaps without a hint of irony, that he had found, quote, a perfect wilderness. Pratt's tannery in Prattsville grew to consume an astounding 6,000 cords of hemlock bark annually at its peak, an astounding amount. But as the tanner's greed boomed, it outstripped the mountain's resources, leading to eventual devastation. The average tannery in the Catskills lasted a mere 32 years, and Pratt's behemoth only survived 20. By 1845, no hemlocks could be found within a 10-mile radius of Pratt's tannery, forever altering his perfect wilderness. In his essay on American scenery, Thomas Cole observes that the consequent association of nature is of God, and he maintains that the voice of prophets, like John the Baptist, that was heard in the wilderness is, quote, yet heard in American wilderness. Cole maintains that nature could be an antidote to the sordid tendencies of mankind. Thus, by stripping the mountains of their natural beauty and their resources, Cole saw these tanneries and industries as assaulting a divine manifestation and removing a powerful spiritual defense against greed. As deforestation spiraled and industry raged in the Catskills, Cole became increasingly convinced that industry, this unchecked industry that he saw around him, could not remain compatible with nature as he saw it. He expressed this sentiment both publicly and privately. In a letter to his dear friend and patron, Luman Reed, Cole observes progress in the Catskills, saying that they're cutting down all the trees in the beautiful valley on which I have looked so often with a loving eye. In the same letter, He implores his friend Asher B. Durand, a fellow painter who was staying with Luman Reed at the time, to, quote, join me in maledictions against all dollar-godded utilitarians. At the Catskill Lyceum in 1841, while delivering his lecture on American scenery, Cole laments industry, saying that yet I cannot but express that the beauty of such landscapes is quickly passing away. The ravages of the axe are daily increasing, and the most noble scenes are often laid desolate with a wantonness and barbarism scarcely credible of a people who call themselves civilized. As the tanning industry boomed in the Catskills, commodifying the landscape as the raw materials for industry, so too, paradoxically, did the landscape tourism industry concurrently rise. The Catskill Mountain House, which was at the forefront of this landscape tourism industry, first opened its doors in 1824 and was built from timber harvested from nearby South Mountain. The region and the Mountain House in particular were bolstered by visits, high-profile visits, by the likes of the Marquis de Lafayette and other visitors to the area. As the Catskills and the Mountain House in particular surged in popularity for the sights that could be seen in the area, so too, coincidentally, did Cole's fame surge for depicting these sights in paints. Cole even depicted the Mountain House on multiple occasions, such as the two paintings we've just seen, and included it as a miniature in many of his paintings of the Catskill Creek. These paintings show the Mountain House as a pleasant mountain retreat in its variegated foliage and pleasant scenery. But one later painting that Cole created, called the Catskill Mountain House, The Four Elements, imagined the Mountain House in a much different, more fantastic setting than these other paintings. Cole first visited the idea of depicting the Mountain House in his plans for the doors of Luman Reed's New York gallery. Reed came to visit Cole in Catskill in 1835 and told Cole of his plans to have various artists decorate panels on doors that would lead to his New York gallery. Cole was evidently very excited with the idea and hastily began sketches and plans for his ideas of what his doors could look like. He created sketches for the four elements of nature and followed these up quickly with the four elements of space, followed still by those of inanimate and then animate objects, creating a total of 16 panels out of the 4 that Reed allotted him. In his plans for Luman Reed's doors, Cole sought to use natural motifs to represent the various elements. In the margins, Cole scribbled that the elements of space are mental, or affections or motions of the mind, as moved by material nature. The great elements first are natural. In his plans for these doors, Cole sought to see how he could define the 4 elements through natural motifs, and then by extension define space through these motifs and communicate the elements of inanimate and animate objects by extension. However, a particularly cold winter between 1835 and 1836 froze the Hudson River and thus obstructed Thomas Cole's travel down to New York City. By the time he could reach New York City to realize his ambitious plans for Luman Reed's doors, his dear friend and most stalwart patron was dead, and so too, seemingly, were Cole's ambitions for the 4 elements. In the Catskill Mountain House, The Four Elements, Cole revisited this plan for depicting the 4 elements, albeit in a modified sense from his original ideas and some 7 or 8 years after Reed's death. In this painting, Cole has chosen a similar view to his 2 lakes in the Mountain House from 1844. However, here he's accentuated the stone outcropping in the foreground and included a storm over the Mountain House, significant perhaps of air and water, and a raging fire on the painting's other extreme. In its variegated wilderness and its panoramic scenery, the Mountain House in some ways makes a natural setting to play out this theater of the 4 elements upon. However, in his inclusion of the Mountain House, this potent symbol of industry, or not necessarily industry, but commerce and civilization, it seems to an extent out of place. In the 1840s, as industry raged in the Catskills and and deforestation spiraled, a fire was not an uncommon sight in the region around the mountain house, either as a result of wildfire caused indirectly by industry or directly as the result of industrial processes. Thus, perhaps by including this fire on the painting's extremity, Cole meant to indict the region's industry and its calamitous associations. By any extent, by the late 1830s and into the 1840s, Cole began to question if industry might have more calamitous effects than his present disillusionment. If the source of America's great wealth, its frenzied harvesting of natural resources, might ultimately prove to be its great and final undoing. Cole visited these ideas of mankind's severance with nature in a couple of written pieces, particularly Verdura, or A Tale After Time, and The Lament of the Forest. And there's an earlier unpublished version of The Lament of the Forest called The Complaint of the Forest, which is pictured here, that also exists, but they're functionally very similar. In The Lament of the Forest, Cole perhaps takes his cues from another famous tale from the Catskills in depicting a narrator venturing deep within the mountains and falling asleep. In his dreams, this narrator is visited by the personified voice of the Catskills that laments the thousands of years where all was peace and harmony before the arrival of mankind. Cole here uses visceral language, saying that, for example, each hill and every valley has become an altar unto Mammon, and the gods of man's idolatry, the victims we. Missouri's floods are ruffled as by storm, and Hudson's rugged hills at midnight glow by light of man-projected meteors. We feed 10,000 fires, and our short day, the woodland growth of centuries is consumed. Cole here paints a vivid, layered image of despoiled hills and valleys, paying testament to greed and their very barrenness. Cole echoes John Milton and Mammon, who is here significant of avarice, particularly the materialistic avarice that is specific to industrial modes of production. Cole describes the lurid midnight glow and 10,000 fires, significant of industry and the rapidity with which it changed the land, and particularly the Catskills. His lament ends with the voice prophesizing that in a few short years, our ancient race shall be like Israel's, scattered among the tribes of man. Cole later revisited this idea of an apocalyptic future created by industry in his tale Verdura, or A Tale After Time. In Verdura, Cole pictures an America at the end of the 20th century, a land populated by hundreds of millions spanning the continent, a disjointed people where no area is left untouched by the vestiges of industry. In Verdura, Cole envisions greed and pride as taking center stage in this society, not unlike the civilization that he pictures in The Course of Empire, or even as how he envisions his contemporaries in 19th century America. However, unlike 19th century America, which had an abundance to support its population, Cole views the land of Verdura as struggling under the weight of its enormous population. He sees these people as seeking to extract as much wealth as possible as they can from their fellow peers and from the land itself, as promulgating lawlessness and atheism and environmental ruin in their wake. Thus, Cole's concern for deforestation and unchecked industry had a sense of urgency to it. Cole prophesied that consumerism and avarice, that the insatiable appetites of dollar-godded utilitarians could only have one ending, that America in the 19th century was still a land of abundance, spoke much more to the sheer natural wealth of the continent than any kind of temperance on behalf of its inhabitants. Without change, Cole prophesied that it was only a matter of time, a few short years, before population outstripped the resources, leading to utter ruin. Although Cole was really an early environment or early proponent of some of these environmental concerns, he certainly wasn't alone in thinking this way in his time. The same year that Cole published his essay on American scenery in the American Monthly Magazine, Ralph Waldo Emerson published his seminal essay, Nature. The proximity, both literally and figuratively, of Cole and Emerson really makes the possibility of their acquaintance almost tantalizing. However, even though they had many chances to meet, they seemingly passed each other on all occasions. For example, both Emerson and Cole were frequenters of the Lyceum circuit in the 1830s and beyond. The Lyceum movement was a 19th century movement that sought to combine public education with entertainment in the form of lectures, really not unlike the TED Talks of today. Cole presented his essay on American scenery in the mid-1830s before the American Lyceum in New York City, and later in 1841 before the Catskill Lyceum in Catskill. The Lyceums congregated in various public spaces. For example, the Catskill Lyceum met in the Baptist church in town. And while Cole was presenting these Lyceum speeches in the 1830s and 40s, Emerson began an extensive tour of the Lyceums beginning in the 1830s. Similarly, as Cole published Essay on American Scenery in American Monthly Magazine, the same year, Emerson sought to publish his Nature in the same magazine. Later, when the Knickerbocker magazine in New York City would play host to many of Cole's seminal writings, including The Lament of the Forest, Emerson sought to publish Nature in that magazine. Even though the two of them never met, many of their ideas about nature seem to synchronize with each other, so to speak. For example, while Emerson wrote that he was part or particle of God, Cole maintained that the consequent association of nature is that of God. When writing to his early patron, Robert Gilmore, on the dangers of shackling an artist's imagination to the physical realities of nature, Emerson wrote that the painter should give the suggestion of a finer creation than we know. So, though they may have never met and were personally estranged, many of their ideas seem to fall in sync with each other. A similar tale could be told of Cole and Henry David Thoreau, or even Cole and John Muir. Like Thoreau and Walden Pond or Muir and Yosemite, Cole cultivated a site-specific relationship with his paintings and meditations on the Catskill Creek. Cole painted the Catskill Creek more than any other landscape that he visited in his career, and often used the familiar setting as a theater to play out these rapid changes and anxieties that he had surrounding the landscape. In his selective editing of the landscape, sometimes foregrounding foliage that didn't exist by the time he arrived, or other times dramatizing the barrenness of the Catskills, he really wrestled with changes to his home. In following Cole's death and at the end of his life and shortly thereafter, a more scientific understanding of changes to the landscape began to emerge. Alexander von Humboldt, the German polymath and explorer, published in 1845 the first volume of his Cosmos, which was an expose of the science of nature. One could imagine Cole reading Cosmos and finding inspiration in its pages, not unlike Frederick Church or other later Hudson River School painters enjoyed. George Perkins Marsh, who's best known for his 1864 volume Man and Nature, began to think of the earth as a system of interrelated subsystems, of which mankind was both a part of and could exert an undue influence upon. Marsh realized that temperature, soil quality, precipitation, and forest cover, all and many others, could be impacted by factors such as agriculture and urban development. Meanwhile, in 1856, early American scientist Eunice Foote published the first rigorous scientific proof of the greenhouse effect before the American Association of Science. Foote's findings, which went largely undiscovered for over 150 years, were really delivered before the Academy before a man, because in this era, it was considered uncouth for a woman to deliver her findings before the association. It wasn't until 2011 that Foote's discoveries were popularly rediscovered. In fact, credit for her discoveries of the greenhouse effect went erroneously to a Scotsman named John Tyndall, who, after Foote published this paper, published a remarkably similar paper of his own shortly thereafter. Even though Marsh and Foote and even Humboldt are coming from this really starkly different knowledge base than Cole is coming from, their findings lend evidentiary credence to Cole's visions of unchecked industry leading to environmental collapse. Shortly after Cole's death, his influence can be felt in environmentalists and artists and in the legacy of land preserved in the name of ecology. The Hudson River School legitimized through painting many of the landscapes and sites that became national and state parks. Cole's presence can be felt through the likes of Walt Whitman, who extolled the kindred spirits, which is here pictured and depicts Thomas Cole, with his good friend William Cullen Bryant. Whitman wrote of how painting could inspire his poetry more than poetry itself could. Cole's presence persisted through generations of environmentalists who sought to preserve the land as a spiritual place. And Aldo Leopold's A Sand County Almanac, one of the seminal texts of the 20th century environmental movement, one can't help but hear echoes of Cole and his lament and Leopold's insistence to think long-term, as a mountain might. Cole's legacy as an environmentalist comes in his urgings to reconcile mankind's relationship with nature before greed outstrips man's abundance. Cole prophesied that it was only a matter of time before mankind's greed outstripped nature, leading to utter ruin. It was his challenge to the future to end this before it was too late. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ann Comer. I'm a 2019 through 2020 Cole Fellow, and my fellowship presentation is Experiencing the History of America Through Art, On-Site and Online Adventures. My fellowship project focused on bringing accessible design to the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. In June of 2019, I began working with the Education Committee on a multi-year project in the discovery phase of a tool that's going to be used to teach about American history and Thomas Cole in U.S. history classrooms. I also worked on a 360-degree tour of the Thomas Cole National Historic Site, which goes into the main house and also the old studio, and also shows parts of our grounds as well. In the last 2 weeks of my fellowship, I'm also going to be working on accessible design for printed and digital materials on site. Now, when the digital education team first started working on the education project in June of 2019, we had no idea that in January of 2020, we would be hit with the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I think it's really important that digital education projects are being created by museums and for online classroom use, and also classroom use when schools eventually do reopen again. But I think it's important for museums to really use our resources to be helpful to teachers and to students who are now very quickly having to create digital content for their curriculum and for online education. So I think it's important that we are aware of the importance of digital education, especially right now. I'm also very interested in accessible design, and all of the projects that I propose or that I work on, I really want to be as ADA compliant as possible. A curator named Amanda Kasha is a huge inspiration to me, and in one of her exhibitions in 2014 called "What a Body Can Do," she describes access as access involves more than checking off a list of practical accommodations. It is a way of thinking about the world that challenges us to imagine how another body, another self experiences it. In this exhibition, access is treated not as an afterthought, but as a creative process intrinsic both to art practice and curatorial practice. I really agree with Amanda that we need to think about the museum experience fully as a way in which we experience it through our bodies and also through different modes of learning. I think it's important to interact with all the senses and to think about different ways in which people learn within the museum. We have the visual part pretty much down because we are interacting with mostly visual forms of media, but or visual forms of art pieces. But I think it's important that we think about exactly how we're moving through the space and how we can make every visitor feel comfortable learning and have that work kind of the work of having to make their own accommodations already be within the museum as well, so they have a fuller experience. Now, back to digital education, which is another form of accessibility. I first started working on researching Common Core standards for New York State public schools, specifically 5th through 8th grade. Now, in US history classrooms during this time, you start to learn about the historical development of the Constitution in practice. The early 19th century is an incredibly rich part of American history because we've just written a Constitution and now it's in practice. And the period before the Civil War isn't as covered in digital forms of education as much as it could be. So I think this is a great opportunity for the Thomas Cole site to look at the early 19th century history, but specifically in this area in the Catskills, looking at industrialization and kind of challenging our students to think about industrialization historically, but also what we're seeing today with environmental changes to our own environments. So Thomas Cole, of course, the other things that were happening during his lifetime are westward expansion, which he did know about. He was aware of the Trail of Tears, and also Reformation movements, which really begin a little bit after he passes away. And then, of course, leading up to Nation Divided, which is the Civil War. So we have the opportunity to really talk about industrialization and the changes to environment and also social discourse in the early 19th century as it relates to the history of Catskill, but using Thomas Cole's paintings as a lens to look at different changes socially that are happening in the US. Now, in order to even start thinking about what this game would look like, we need to start looking at games that already exist and to benchmark them. So I started playing a lot of games at work. I started playing Oregon Trail. I probably played it about 50 times. And it's a really interesting game because you have to step into the role of someone on the Oregon Trail, and you are facing life or death situations within the game. So your ox can break its leg halfway through the journey. The axle of your wheel can break as well. You can get bitten by a rattlesnake, or you can run out of food as well. So this game is based on points, and you accumulate points in order to purchase materials, or just by luck finding materials on the side of the road in some ways. So this game is quite interesting because it's not really focused on archival materials. It's clear that research was done for its creation, but it's also been used in schools. I know that my middle school used this game in order to teach us about US history. But this is an example of a game that wasn't immediately intended for educational use in the classroom, but it was adopted in later. Now, the next game that I looked at was Walled in a Game, which was created by the University of Southern California Game Lab. And I had the amazing opportunity to talk to Tracy Fullerton, who was the creator of Walled in a Game. And we sat down and talked about the different ways in which these games are created. So for instance, in Walled in a Game, the art is based on the Hudson River School, specifically Thomas Cole, of course. But this game is based on stillness. And the idea that you have to regain your energy throughout the game by reading and exploring the woods and growing food as well, and just having a sense of stillness within it. And that's another way of approaching learning. In this game, you have to read within the game, which is something I had never encountered before in one of these educational tools. But it challenges me, it was a challenge for me to make that switch from a points-based game to a game where my role within it was to kind of be an extension of Walden himself, and to kind of interact with his thoughts and think about his writing in a different way. So one of the most helpful things that Tracy and I talked about was the creation of having a narrator for the game, or having a sidekick in some ways, to kind of bring you into the game's world and to introduce you to what you were going to be experiencing. So for creating Thomas Cole's game, there's a chance that you could be interacting with Thomas Cole himself, or you could be interacting with a local or a family member, in order to kind of give you that that inside knowledge of the world of the game and how you learn within it and who you interact with. So it's kind of this placement thing of how you enter and create the world and navigate throughout it. Now, the last game that I looked at was Mission US, which was specifically created for with curriculum in mind. So the Mission US series is an amazing tool, and they have a lot of different modules within the game in order to teach you about different parts of American history. So this is Mission 3, and this is the game that does tackle the Trail of Tears as well. So this is one of their really important modules that does cover that. So this was a great way to start to see how curriculum-based learning and archival research kind of come together for a game intended for classroom use. So I learned a lot about the length of time for how long each chapter of a game should be for use in the classroom in order to have questions afterwards. And that it's important to have a bit of a reward system once in a while for students learning information. In Mission US, you have to retain what you've learned earlier as well. So it's a really great way of showing history in a different way. And as you can see in each of these different games, they have a totally different style of art as well, which is quite exciting when we're thinking about how to transform a Thomas Cole painting into a game, which I'll touch upon later. Now our next step was recreating the world of Thomas Cole. So this was the part of our discovery phase where I was able to start thinking about narrative and kind of brainstorm with the education committee in our meetings about what we would like this game to look at. Again, my role this year was to work with the discovery phase of the education committee. So the narrative is going to change quite a bit in the coming years. The entire project could change as well. So what you're seeing tonight or today is really a first step of what this could possibly look like in the future. So we went through about 30 different Thomas Cole paintings, and we finally settled on Thomas Cole's 1843 painting River in the Catskills, which has a huge number of industrialization little motifs within it. So what we wanted to do with that was look at the figures and the different things that were within the painting, and then go to archival research, then pursue archival research to kind of see what was really going on in Catskill and how to bring in different characters to interact with the student. So this painting, although the figures in different places within it are painted quite small, we have to remember that Thomas Cole was also using his imagination when he was creating these paintings, because he was putting in and taking out different signs of industrialization. So it's not really a far stretch to also create narrative to go along with the different characters that are present within the painting. For instance, this is the man with the axe. And for his character, what a student could do was walk up to him and talk to him about logging that was happening in the Catskills, and also talk to him about the hemlock groves and the fact that the hemlock bark was used for the tanning processes here in the Catskills. We also have a small figure of the the Canada-Harry Railroad running through the painting, which by the time Thomas Cole was painting this painting, this particular portion of the railroad was no longer there. So he has added it back in, which is quite interesting when you think about how Thomas Cole was painting industrialization in the area. We also have my favorite character, who's the man in the boat, because he gives the student a really great opportunity to talk to him about Silas Scribner, who had a mill up at the top of Catterskill Falls, which actually blocked the falls, and then caused Thomas Cole to paint Lake with Dead Trees, another painting, because there was so much pollution in the water from blocking from the damming of the damming, and then also the mill, that it actually killed a lot of the fish that were in Catskill Creek. So there are ecological changes that happen because of industrialization, which is a really great direct link to Thomas Cole's writings as well. So I think this is such a great character for those reasons. We also have houses in this painting as well, specifically the Van Vechten property, which the president of the Canada-Harry Railroad, Thomas B. Cook, purchases the Van Vechten property from the Van Vechtens in 1836, and then that's when the Canada-Harry Railroad, that portion that you see in the painting, is built because it's on Thomas B. Cook's land now. So this is all quite interesting in thinking about the different changes of property and how it moves hands, and also thinking about how the community felt about the changes in industrialization, whether they were in support or if they were like Thomas Cole and they were quite against it. Now, this is a really exciting part of this presentation, because this is what the game could possibly look like. This was a mock-up created by Electric Fun Stuff for us to look at how we could possibly show River in the Catskills. We also have the possibility of making the world of the game a little bit more like Thomas Cole's original work, but we also have the opportunity to change it completely. So I just want to use this particular image as an inspiration for the different ways in which we could approach creating the digital world. It could either be closer to the original source material, or it can become a bit different. So there are a lot of different opportunities for us. For reference, this is a map of the Canada-Harry Railroad in the 1840s, which is what is shown earlier within Thomas Cole's painting. And then I also have the primary source document demonstrating the fact that the Van Vechtens did in fact sell their property to Thomas B. Cook, who was the president of the Canada-Harry Railroad as well. Now, this game is, of course, still in the beginning stages, so it's going to change drastically in the next few years, but it's been really a great opportunity for me to be able to work on a team and to learn from everybody around me, and to have the opportunity to just have a really creative year to think about the archive and how it can be used to make digital content as well. So thank you so much to the education team for allowing me to be a part of this project. I'm really excited to see where it goes in the future. Now, my other project here on site was the creation of a 360-degree tour of the Cedar Grove property, specifically the main house and the old studio. This project will be filmed this summer, and it's really exciting because it's going to allow visitors to interact with the different objects that are in the home, and then also to click on different portions of the house in order to learn a bit about the restoration process and also the interpretive process that goes behind the scenes a little bit more. So this is really exciting because I'm hoping that this will increase the amount of questions we get about the different objects that are in the house, but also it's going to be a great training tool for our educators and for our new fellows to be able to look at what's in the house and kind of get an idea of how the objects fit into the space as well. I'm really mostly excited for the 360 tour of the old studio. During parts of the day, this room can be quite dark, and I think it's really exciting that our visitors are going to be able to look closely at the different objects that are in each of the rooms and to learn a bit more and to perhaps come into their own tours, come into the tours or come into explore with more questions that are related to each of the objects. So I think it's just going to be a great extension to what we already do on site. I'm also working on some other accessibility projects. I'm working on a Know Before You Go guide, which is going to cover all of the different accommodations that we offer here on site. I'm also working on website updates to make sure it is ADA accessible. And then I'm also working on a sensory map, which I got this idea from the Cooper Hewitts, because we are getting a lot of technological experiences on site. It's important that we kind of write down where, or show exactly where there are multimedia experiences. And so our visitors can be prepared for their visit. And then also large text booklets, and lastly, baby changing stations, since we are getting younger families, with younger visitors here on site. I think it's great that we get baby changing stations so that they don't have to go off site and they can continue their visit here on site. Now, I really feel that museums were, for me, a great place to learn. It's where I had my most successful lessons, and the museum educators that I interacted with as a child are really the people that inspired me to go into museum work myself. And I think that in regards to accessibility, one of the things that I remember reading about with the anthropologist, when I was studying the anthropologist Margaret Mead, is that she claimed that that accessibility you really see signs of it when communities have really come together. So I think that that's one of the reasons why accessibility in museums is so important, is that we need to remember how different bodies move through space, and the more accessible we can make our projects, the more welcoming they are to everybody who comes into the museum space. And I remember Margaret Mead reading that she said that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can't change the world, for indeed that's all who ever have. And I think that as museum workers, we want to inspire people through art and interaction with different objects to really think about how the world has changed quite a bit, and to also be quite reflexive on what is already within the museum. So I want to thank the Thomas Cole National Historic Site for allowing me to be a fellow this year. This has been an incredible experience. I've gotten to do work that I am just over the moon happy with, and I'm really excited that I got to spend a year working on accessible projects and also working with the Digital Education Committee on this exciting multi-year project as well. So thank you so much for allowing me to do this, and thank you all for tuning in.